Good stuff. So if you've been following us over the last couple of weeks, you'll know that we've been doing a series on mercy and mission, picking up the theme from our devoted conference that we had over August bank holiday. So last week we looked at the topic of cities of refuge in Joshua, and we saw that at this fundamental kind of ground zero starting point for the people of God, as they went into the land that they'd been promised many generations before, God laid out for them in the fabric of society a structure for justice, and more than that, a structure for restoration and renewal, even when people had done shocking things. That there was a sense of grace and mercy bound up in the fabric of how God intended their society to work. So we're going to roll the clock forward this morning to see how that panned out. Spoiler alert, didn't go all that well. So if you just want to have a quick look at Isaiah 2, and I'll explain the connection as we get there. So the word that Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many peoples shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. I don't know how many of you have ever read Black Box Thinking by Matthew Said. It encourages organisations to examine the gap between what things should look like, what we think it looks like, and how they actually are. If we apply this principle to Israel, they had been established, they had been led from slavery into the promised land, and they had been mightily blessed. They were prosperous and safe under David and Solomon. Many had visited Solomon because of his profound wisdom and the obvious blessing of God on him and the nation that he led. People came to learn from him and catch a slice of God's blessing. And those were the glory days. But when we join them here in Isaiah 2, we're not in those days anymore. We're not in the glory days. Actually, now it's the days of 4 kings, a divided nation, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. And Judah was tiny in comparison with the huge empires of Egypt and Assyria. But with the sister kingdom of Israel, they occupied a strategic place along the land routes linking Africa with Central Asia and the Far East. So they're laying at the centre of the known world. And they made this astonishing claim as they sat there in the centre of the known world, that the Lord was the creator and the ruler of everything. Uzziah and the kings that came before him were the Lord's vice-regents, who he had installed on Zion, his holy hill, which would become the centre of the world. Judah and Israel lived in the conviction that the Lord was the true king, and looked forward to the day when all the earth would know it. But then Isaiah sees through the veneer, revelation from God. He sees what God is doing in the nation, why he's doing it, and where everything was heading under his sovereign control. Isaiah's prophecy is breathtaking in its scope. It's way more than just one nation at one point in history. It embraces all nations, reaching to the very end of time. In the year that King Uzziah died, Isaiah saw God the King high and exalted, the whole earth full of his glory. In real time, though, a huge Assyrian army stands at the gates of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was at their mercy. And Isaiah knew still that God was supreme ruler. God would determine the fate of Assyria and Judah. The Assyrians would not determine the fate of the world, that God would. Isaiah was old school. He had an old school creed. But here's the thing that he saw, is that the kings of Judah and Israel found it really hard to translate trust of Yahweh into modern politics. They attempted to make treaties with earthly powers to protect their minnow nation from big empires around them. And the common people began to give religion lip service. The Assyrian king mocked the notion of a living God as madness. Mocked Israel for charting its whole course by what they called the brightest morning star. Even adopted the term morning star himself. He called the nation into line, his line, rather than Yahweh. Reality is, though, it got worse before it got better. It was dark days for the people of God. Judah and Jerusalem lay under the ever-increasing threat of destruction from Assyria. Pagan rites were introduced. Dissent was ruthlessly crushed. Rumour has it Isaiah himself was eventually sawn in two by King Manasseh, the first king of Judah, because he was a troublemaker. And before his death, Isaiah could hardly appear in public for fear of threat to life. And yet, in this crazy, bizarre season, he passed on spiritual treasures that have been passed down through history. Isaiah's prophecy is a huge wake-up call for God's people. Chapter 1 starts with, "Hear the word of the Lord, people." And then worse still, name-check Sodom and Gomorrah. You know you're in trouble when you're being referenced as Sodom and Gomorrah. They're the bad guys of the Old Testament. And what he's saying is that the rulers and the people of Jerusalem were involved in something every bit as offensive to God as Sodom and Gomorrah were. So buck up, folks. You might want to get a pen. You might want to take note of this, because Isaiah is saying, hear the word of the Lord. So what is their big rebellion? What is it that they've done that they've got so wrong? What murderous evil had they committed that compares them to Sodom and Gomorrah? What is the deadliest of all sins? Chapter 1 verse 2 calls it open rebellion. Not casually losing their way, not just mild apathy and uncertainty, but open rebellion against God. God describes them as children I have reared up and brought up that have rebelled against me. Let's think. The international scene was full of threat. Foreign invasions have left a trail of desolation across the region. The nation is like a victim of a savage mugging. There's been obsessive religious observance and sacrifices coming out of their ears. Temple attendance, monthly, weekly observance and prayers, but somehow it has not got through to God. He has not reversed the nation's disastrous situation, despite all their religious observance. City life has become degenerate and dangerous. The leaders have become corrupt and self-seeking, and the wealth of the nation has not been distributed equally. The economic elite have cared little for the have-nots beneath them, and there are deep fissures opened in society as justice was bought and sold, or worse, disregarded and replaced with violent exploitation and repression. Religious observance continued, but could no longer conceal the rot of what was beneath the veneer. The creed that the Lord was king had somehow become hollow. And as such, the ethical implications or restraints of declaring the Lord was king had been disregarded. And actually, for the common person on the ground, the creed no longer inspired much confidence, because when you looked out on the changing world beyond their fragile borders, there was fear and trepidation. Isaiah repeatedly counselled the kings to stand firm in their convictions. But worship became increasingly divorced from justice in their community. And the fatherless and the widows and those in poverty became the chief victims. So why so bad? It's just capitalism at work, right? It's just normal society. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Dog eat dog, survival of the fittest. Just how it is, it's life. But we have to understand that for the Jewish people, disregard for justice was a fundamental violation of the Sinai covenant. A fundamental violation of the structures that God had given them to build their community around. And no amount of cultish religious fervour could compensate for that. The Exodus itself, their rescue from slavery, had flowed out of God's concern for the oppressed. Because during their long period of slavery, God had heard their groaning and remembered his promises to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. God had instructed his people to have a special concern for the poor and the defenceless among them. He told them in Exodus 22, do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Don't take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. If ye do, they will cry out to me, and I will hear them. Religious performance doesn't make up for injustice. And I would say this to you, that this requirement has not reduced under the New Covenant, has not reduced as New Testament Christians. If anything, it has intensified. You know the parable of the Good Samaritan, but that conversation starts with a question: what must I do to be saved? So it starts with a question about salvation and the very nature of salvation, and ends with the story of the Good Samaritan. There's a link. The people of God inherently know how to be good neighbours to those in need. James' description of religion that God accepts as pure and faultless. You remember that? James 1. What is the religion that God accepts as pure and faultless? To look after the orphans and the widows in their distress. The cross places us under a greater obligation to love the marginalised and the vulnerable than the Old Testament ever could. Many of you are Tim Keller fans, I know, so it always helps my case to find a Tim Keller quote. Tim says this, Tim, my buddy, first name basis Tim. To my surprise, he says there's a distinct relationship between a person's grasp and experience of God's grace and his or her heart for the justice and the poor. There's a relationship between a person's grasp and experience of God's grace and his or her heart for justice and the poor. It goes on and says, I've observed over the decades that when people see the beauty of God's grace in Christ, it leads them powerfully towards justice. Isaiah challenges the people. He says ceremonial worship and prayer are worthless if they are not accompanied by an active concern for justice. Uzziah's reign has been long and prosperous, but concern for the poor had dried up. And we find bound up in that it was God's intention that the people of God would be a blessing to all nations. And the Old Testament repeatedly instructs his people to care for the alien or the sojourner in their midst. Those who dwelt among the people of the God, but were not part of God's covenant community by heritage or cultural background. I've said earlier, Israel occupied this central position in the region. The rise and fall of nations and empires repeatedly displaced whole communities and brought refugees to seek shelter among the Israelites. The number of aliens or refugees living among them at times was huge. We see that when Solomon does his census in 2 Chronicles. God wanted his people to know that he loved and cared for the well-being of such people. The fatherless, the widows, the defenceless and the vulnerable, the destitute and the poverty-bound. God promises to be their defense, their judge, and we find it in Deuteronomy, we find it in the Psalms, we find it in Jeremiah, we find it in Zechariah, we find it in Malachi, we find it in Amos, we find it. You could never accuse God of being unclear on this topic. You could never suggest he kept quiet or merely hinted. Do you know there are truths that we hold on to as a church really tightly that are far less clearly explained than this is. I don't want to give you examples because that would be unhelpful. But where the language is much more subtle. This could not be any clearer. It could not be repeated anymore. And God pushes the point even to the degree that it should have financial implications for us.
Yeah, keep going, Dave.
I count at least 6 occasions in the Old Testament where God instructs farmers to leave a portion of their harvest freely available for the poor and foreigner to take and eat for free. They could have sold that food for profit, but God asked them to leave it out for people to take. God repeatedly reminds his people that he had once delivered them from slavery in Egypt, and at one time they had wandered in the desert with nothing, and he had provided for them. He had been merciful to the people. Therefore, says Leviticus, when a foreigner lives among you, do not mistreat them, because the foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born, as if they were part of your family. Love them as yourself, because you were foreigners in Egypt, and I am the Lord your God. I don't think that's a threat he's put in there, but there is an element of, hey people, I rescued you. Now let's live that. You might be sitting there saying, I haven't got a lot. You may not. Do you know how the UN defines extreme poverty? Describes it as the severe deprivation of basic human needs, including food, safe drinking water, sanitation, healthcare, shelter, and education. Summarised as living on less than $1 a day. We see that very really at the moment. Very really? We see it very clearly in Afghanistan at the moment, as the schools open for boys and not for girls. The World Poverty Check, you can go on the website and it gives you this nice little infographic that tells you at any given point how many people are moving out of poverty, how many are moving into poverty. Do you want to have a guess, as of 2021, how many people globally might be living in this definition poverty provided by the UN, living on less than $1 a day. How many people do you think? I checked it last night. Go on. 1.6 billion. Anybody else want to have a guess? 2 billion.
2.6 billion.
Well, I think it counts. I'm questioning myself about how many noughts I've counted. But I counted 713 million people living on under $1 a day. It may have been more, it may have been billion, I don't know, I need to check. The percentage is about 8% of the globe.
Yeah. That's huge.
So if we divided up the room and partitioned off 10% of you, remarkable. There are 18 countries right now where global poverty is on the increase. And it is on our doorstep as well. I do want to commend you though. I went through our finances last night thinking about this. And do you know we spent £27,000 on our food bank last year? £27,000. Just you lot. And that's in the context of giving away £14,000 to social action and churches in deprived or struggling nations around the world, either through Christ Central churches or through our relationships with the Ukraine and Cambodia. Just the food bank spending on its own is about 25% of our turnover. It's about a quarter of everything that we spent last year went on serving the needs of those in poverty in the community, plus what we spent overseas. I should have worked out what the percentage of that as well. But we're beginning this appeal this week for you guys to gather up products that we can give to people moving into homes for the first time in this community. I'd love you to, let me just wave one here. We've got all our food bank supplies, so this is like the next step, right, where we can put toilet rolls and we can put cleaning products and we can put cloths and we can put deodorants and personal hygiene products and feminine hygiene products all in a bag. And then Cheshire East, whenever they house somebody in this area, they're going to ring me on my mobile, and within 24 hours we're going to zip a food parcel and a welcome parcel to their home and befriend them. That's what we're about. We want to be a people that on the smallest scale sees somebody across the room and crosses the room. We want to be a people that are prepared to thrive across our community. We want to be a people that will share our food, that will share our stuff, that, if you allow me to borrow the New Testament phrase, will have all things in common. There's that moment in Acts 4 where they gather up their offering and they lay it at the apostles' feet to be distributed to those in need. The reason I tell you those numbers today is not to boast, although I love it, and I will boast a bit to people outside. Do you know what my church is doing right now? This percentage being spent of all our resource, not on bricks and mortar, not on salaries, not on travel expenses, but on provision for the poor and the needy. And it's sacrificial. It's sacrificial because we could be developing our toilets, and we could have a kitchen by now. With that amount of money, we could. It's sacrificial, and I want to commend you for it, guys, that you put the money at our feet and enable us to reach those that most need. That is beautiful. And you are kids, you need to listen to this. This is a fundamental part of what it is to follow Jesus. To sacrificially pick up your resources and say, do you know what, that's a little bit more than I need right now, so I can put that there. And it might be I buy one less console game, or it might be I don't have the new trainers, or it might be I go without my fancy coffee every now and then, as it might be. But it's a culture, it's a mindset that I will go through life and sacrificially lay down what I have for those that need it more than I do. And you may not have loads of money. But you know what? You can do it in the way that you choose to interact with people. Because there will be people turning up in your classrooms. There may well be people turning up in your form, in your English lesson, in your yard, that have come from the other side of the globe and have nothing. And you can welcome them in a way that they find belonging in your community. You can become the gatekeepers to your community. And you don't have to give them money, but actually just treating them as if they were one of yours. That's that Leviticus instruction, right? Treat them as if they're part of your tribe. Treat them as if they belonged at your dinner table. Treat them as if they have a right to belong where you belong. In case you are lacking any conviction right now, just want to point out that God really isn't messing about in his dealings with Israel right now. Because if we scan through Isaiah, we see how serious God is about this. Judah and Israel are so estranged from God, they hardly know his priorities anymore. And they have resisted every attempt by him to regain their attention. And so this is what's coming. In Isaiah 10 we read that God takes up Assyria as a rod. God takes up Assyria. He takes up an empire like it's a stick. That's the level of sovereign power we're talking about. That is awesome. But he takes up Assyria as a rod to chastise them in their own land. And then in Isaiah 39, he uses Babylon to take them out of the promised land. And then in Isaiah 44, when they're broken by suffering, he summons Cyrus of Persia to set them free, to let them return to the promised land and start again. And out of this scourging, out of this disciplining of God, of his people, emerges a people who are truly repentant, described in Isaiah 61 as those who mourn. Isaiah 62, the humble and contrite in spirit, who tremble at the Lord's word. They are the nucleus from which God begins to grow a new people, a new community. He hadn't abandoned them. He hadn't discarded them. And there were those that doubted. There were those when they were in exile. There were those when they were going through the mill that said, God has abandoned us. But actually he's restoring them. He's not bypassing justice because the character of God means he can't do that. Actually their redemption is tied up in his discipline. His holiness insists upon it. And the fresh start can only come through resolving the stain on the nation. History has meaning because God is taking it somewhere. Our history has meaning because God is taking it somewhere. If you are going through it right now, you don't find comfort by saying God has abandoned me. Actually, that journey of struggle, it only has meaning because God is taking it somewhere. And you can look at God's work with Israel in Isaiah, and you can say, he had meaning and purpose there. He was making something there. So God, I consecrate myself again for you to make something anew in me. Isaiah sees the nation streaming to Zion to share in the salvation that has been realized in their nation. Jesus is the light of the world. And if you read through Isaiah, as you progress through, you'll encounter Jesus the suffering servant. You'll see Jesus the Messiah. You'll see Jesus the conqueror. You'll see that his sacrifice is sufficient for all, that he provides rich food and pardon and forgiveness, and that all who are hungry and thirsty may share in it. You know, the task of the church is not just to treat people as gospel fodder, to target the poor folks and bash them with the Bible. The poor are not just a category of people that always need charity from the rich. Actually, the aim is to set people free from sin, sickness, poverty, oppression, to see them released from chains that bind them into a life of opportunity and fullness. Because the heart of God is that all people might rise up, lifted up, to live productive and fruitful lives in the service of King Jesus. The poor in spirit, and the poor in finance, and the poor in relationships, and the poor in health can become rich through the grace of Jesus. 2 Corinthians tells us that though he was rich, he became poor, so that through his poverty we might become rich. And I think we can agree that God chose the poor and the marginalised to shame the wise and the powerful, and the weak to shame the strong. He took David from obscurity to being a king. And David was a foreshadow, a prefigure of Jesus' kingdom. God delights to raise people from the dust, the needy from the ash heap, to seat them with princes and to inherit a throne of honour. And that's what you lot are here for. You're the carriers of that dream in Isaiah 2. So I would just love you to stand for a moment. I'm going to read it over you. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of mountains. The Lord's temple will be established as the highest of mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. And many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of God. And he'll teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths." Lord, I pray for this church. I pray that they will be beacons of hope for the community around. As individuals, in their workplaces, in their homes, in their communities, and as a collective, sacrificially giving to serve through food bank, and to serve through sending funds abroad, and even sending people. Lord, I pray that this would be a community that lifts the needy from the ashes and sees them seated with princes. Children of God, co-heirs with Christ. Lord, I pray for a time in the future where our leadership is littered with people who have been in the ashes, but are now seated with the princes. Lord, I pray for a time in the future where this community is shaped by those who have been in prison, those who have been in desperation, those who have been in addiction, those who have been in crisis. That as we position ourselves as a city of refuge for the community, Lord, I pray that you would do a mighty work in us and through us and around us. That there would be this sense of, as you establish your church, as you raise us up in visibility, that many will come and say, "Teach us the ways of God, and we'll walk in his path." Lord, we pray for that beautiful privilege of discipling people in the ways of God and walking with him. And we just invite your Spirit now to come and equip us, renew us and refresh us, restore us, sharpen our sights, lead us to go again. Lord, we are in anticipation of all that you're going to do. In your name, God. Amen. If you're listening online through YouTube at a later date, we're really glad you're able to join us. I really hope that it was helpful for you. We're going to continue with our service now, and our recording will end. But do get in touch, and we'd love to hear from you. Come again next week as we're going to look again at about the record of Isaiah and how he teaches his people to live. See you again.